American poetry, which you are somehow aware, that's poetry of Sylvia Plath and Adrian Rich, two major female poets of American literary tradition. Both can be introduced as feminist poets, though they have certain other references too, such as Sylvia Plath is better introduced as a confessional poet, and Adrian Rich is introduced as a formal poet. Adrian Rich early work in A Change of World and The Diamond Cutters shows decorous, formal, restrained type of poetry. But even here, there is a sense of subversive impulses. Subversive impulses mean that response to power, that try to challenge power, that try to challenge appropriateness. In her poem, Aunt Jennifer's Tigers, Aunt Jennifer's Tigers and Diving into the Wreck, these are two significant poems that are part of your course. In Aunt Jennifer's Tigers, the speaker presents the picture of a housewife who makes embroidery, and in her embroidery she makes the or carves the image of a tiger, and the woman who does this, that's Aunt Jennifer, and speaker is introducing Aunt Jennifer's Tigers. The character who gives the poem, mean Aunt Jennifer, seems to be crushed beneath patriarchal authority. The massive weight of uncle's wedding band sits heavily upon Aunt Jennifer's hand. So in these two lines, we can realize patriarchal authority and its crushing pressure upon woman or female gender. The tiger Aunt Jennifer has embroidered across the screen suggests her indomitable spirit or unconquerable spirit. Even after her death, the tigers in the panel that she made will go on prancing, proud and unafraid. Means she is not in the world, but she has left behind her panel on which her embroidered work can be seen, and there is an urge of revolt against that crushing patriarchy. Sleek, chivalric, and poised as they are, these animals nevertheless emblematize rebellious energies, turbulent emotions that will not be contained. So polite on the surface, passionate beneath, Aunt Jennifer's art is at this stage Adrian Rich art. We can say whatever is depicted in the poem, that can be taken as a representation of Aunt Jennifer's response through her formal poetry against patriarchy. Gradually, Adrian Rich came to feel that she could no longer go to write a poem with a neat handful of materials. Instead of poems about experience, she decided to create the work like Diving into the Wreck. That is thought her best poem. In her poem Diving into the Wreck, Adrian Rich tells of a journey under the sea during which she has to discard all the conventional sports. We can see a journey from Aunt Jennifer's tigers to diving into the wreck, from a polite formal poetry to a rebellious, unconventional and challenging poetry. She refuses to use the crutches on which she has leaned in the upper world, and she claims, I came to explore the world, explore the wreck. The words are purposes, the words are maps. And she describes what she calls the thing I came for, the wreck and not the story of the wreck. Wreck and not the story of the wreck, the thing itself and not the myth. So that was more radical stance in her poetry, which was not seen in her earlier poetry, which example is Aunt Jennifer's Tigers. So whether it's earlier or later work, we can see a rebellious voice of Adrian Rich. Adrian Rich uses the metaphor of wreck as the wreck of her own life, which she feels compelled to jettison and she has to claim that to be a woman at this time is to know extraordinary forms of anger, joy and impatience, love and hope. So poetry are necessary but not enough. We need to touch the living who share our determination that the sexual myths underlying the human condition can and shall be changed. We can say that is the voice of an activist rather than the voice of a poet or a poet uh, who conforms the standards around. Instead of being a modernist poet, she decides to be a feminist poet. And she led a life, though she was a university professor, but she led a life of an activist. That was norm in her real life. In every lecture, in every class, she asked her students to have 1 minute silence for those girls across the world who could not go to school or who don't have access to formal education. So poetry that was at first stage a mean of expression for her, but in her later works, poetry are the words were maps for her. And that was a map for challenging the conventional notion, conventional standards where women are treated as subservient or dependent or weaker sex. Next point we have to discuss Sylvia Plath. Sylvia Plath is an American poetess and the wife of a British poet and even poet laureate Ted Hughes. She is remembered for her strong poetic idiom and her confession, which she courageously expressed in her poetry. So I have to say a few words about confessional poetry. In 20th century, we have discussed that there was a time of modernist poetry and Ezra Pound, Wallace Stevens, T.S. Eliot, even W.H. Auden, E. Cummings. They were leading American modernist poet, and they had focus on image, they had focus on impersonal poetry, they had focus on an image that has power of suggestivity, image that is precise, but it is full of literary and cultural allusions, literary and cultural relevance, literary and uh, historical myths. At that time, an American poet, Robert Lowell, he emerged on scene with his own idea of poetry that is known as confessional poetry. So we should first remember Robert Lowell, who originated the idea of confessional poetry. He thought that personal confessions are the legitimate subject matter of poetry. We can say that is antithesis of T.S. Eliot concept of poetry. T.S. Eliot has an idea that poet should not be present in his poetry and his mind should act like a catalyst. And his concept was lyrical poet is the lowest stage of poetry, and a poet should be able to read the best works of the past and then create a new one in as a continuity of tradition. But Robert Lowell thought that personal expressions, personal emotions are the legitimate subject of poetry. T.S. Eliot rejected romantic poets and bitterly criticized all romantic poets. But Robert Lowell, he defended somehow romantic poets, though he also criticized the romantic poets on one condition, that they preferred to express what was socially admissible. Mean romantic poets, they claim that they express what they feel, but they always express what is positive in their outlook. Mean we don't know about scenes of Wordsworth, scenes of John Keats, scenes of S.T. Coleridge. How many poems they have written about their own, you can say, flaws, own weakness. So poet who express their confessions, they become the voice of something that was unsaid, that was like a cloud in mind, and poet wants to release that mental burden through poetry. Robert Lowell, he became, you can say, the mentor or idealist of all confessional poets, including Sylvia Plath, Anne Sexton, Amy Lowell, and other uh, confessional poets. Robert Lowell concentrated on a series of unrhymed and irregular sonnets that were collected in books like Notebook, The Dolphin, and History. Talking about these sonnets, Robert Lowell explained that they were written as one poem, intuitive in arrangement. Uh, Confessional poems are mostly intuitive and that are contrary to T.S. Eliot's idea of poetry, but not a pile or sequence of related material. He added they were less an almanac than the story of my life. Story of my life means personal autobiographical poetry that was advocated by confessional poetry. They are further proof of their creators' belief in the power and efficacy of literature. He emphasized that almost manic way, the poet seems intent on metamorphosing all his life into art. Metamorphosing all his life into art, in undoing his every experience, however trivial. कोई experience कितना मामूली, कितना फजूल, कितना ही घटिया क्यों ना हो, it can be expressed in poetry. Rather than you can say in search of a grand theme, we can express our trivial experiences in our poetry. Day by Day is also collection of his poetry. There were different followers of Robert Lowell, including Berryman, our concern is Sylvia Plath. She had a shorter life. She was born in 1932 and in 1963 she committed suicide. At young age, after marriage with Ted Hughes and becoming mother of two children, uh, in her poetry we have recurrent image of a man who appears as oppressor and woman has ambivalent relationship with man. Unlike feminists who want to stand against man, Sylvia Plath is somehow feminist. She is not a real feminist voice. हम कह सकते हैं कि सिल्विया प्लैथ बस कोई 20-25% ही फेमिनिस्ट पोइट है. डोमिनेटली उसकी पोइट्री जो है वो फेमिनिस्ट पोइट्री नहीं समझी जाती और इसलिए नहीं समझी जाती क्योंकि सिल्विया प्लैथ की पोइट्री में देयर इज एन अम्बिवलेंस और मिक्स्ड फीलिंग फॉर मैन. शी हेट्स मैन एंड शी लाइक्स मैन. शी फील्स the absence of man strongly in her life. That was her father, Otto Plath, and later on her husband, Ted Hughes. हम फेमिनिस्ट पोइट्री में, फेमिनिस्ट लिटरेचर में इसके उल्ट देखते हैं कि औरत को किसी मर्द की कोई जरूरत नहीं, उसके बगैर वो जिंदा रह सकती है, सरवाइव कर सकती है. दूसरा जो नोशन है, in Sylvia Plath's poetry, there is domesticity and a reaction against boredom, monotony, and misery of domesticity. Reaction against domesticity makes Sylvia Plath a feminist poet. जो कि ये जो घर के काम काज हैं जो औरत की किस्मत में डाले गए थे पैट्रियार्कल सोसाइटी में, तो इनके खिलाफ चूंकि सारी ही फेमिनिस्ट आवाज उठाती हैं, सिल्विया प्लैथ की पोइट्री में इस डोमेस्टिक लाइफ के खिलाफ रिएक्शन है, लिहाजा इस वजह से वो फेमिनिस्ट के वॉइस बनती है और फेमिनिस्ट पोइट कहलाती है। लेकिन जो दूसरा रेफरेंस है वो मैंने पहले अभी मेंशन किया। फिर ये कि फेमिनिस्ट पोइट्री में स्ट्रगल की बात है, फेमिनिस्ट लिटरेचर में, फिक्शन में स्ट्रगल की बात है, काज की बात है, जबकि सिल्विया प्लैथ की पोइट्री में स्ट्रगल और काज की बजाय एस्केप, डिपेंडेंस और सुसाइडल इंस्टिंक्ट है, जो कि बिल्कुल हम कह सकते हैं कि एंटी फेमिनिस्ट स्टांस है जो उसकी पोइट्री में नजर आता है। Sylvia Plath once said, I have been very excited by what is the new breakthrough that came with Robert Lowell's life studies. Robert Lowell's life studies is thought the, you can say, breakthrough of confessional poetry. This intense breakthrough into very serious, very personal, emotional experience, which I feel has been partly taboo. I mean, in the past, it was a taboo, it was a prohibited idea that one would share his or her personal self, negative personal thoughts. एक पॉइंट जो है वो ये एक्सप्रेस करता है कि वो दूसरों के बारे में कौन से नेगेटिव ख्याल रखता है, वो किसी से एनवियस है, वो किसी से विंडिक्टिव है, किसी के खिलाफ उसकी सीक्रेट हेट्रेड है, he likes backbiting, he is engaged in illicit relationship, he is tempted to violence. ये वो secret personal taboos थे that were not discussed in poetry before confessional poetry. And American confessional poetry introduced a challenge that it can be described. And it was more concerned, I think, for women who could describe certain experience which could not be discussed in the past. For instance, there is a morning song, a poem by Sylvia Plath, in which a mother describes post-delivery trauma or pain of mother, and that is actually almost missed in literature. Mostly we find that mother is eulogized, mother is often presented in a very positive manner in arts and literature. Only a woman who has an experience of motherhood can describe that motherhood also somehow disgusting experience. So that type of feelings, that type of ideas, which were once not the legitimate subject of poetry, they were explored through American confessional poetry. She also says, I think of the poetess Anne Sexton, she was also a confessional poet. Her poems are wonderfully craftsman-like, and yet they have a kind of emotional and psychological depth, which I think is something perhaps quite new and exciting. And Anne Sexton wrote a very impressive poem after suicide of Sylvia Plath. Sylvia Plath's excitement grew, of course, from a sense of kinship. Even her earlier poems are marked by extremism of feeling and melodic cunningness of expression. But it was in the poems published after her death, for example, in Ariel, that the impulse towards oblivion and the pain that generated that impulse were rendered in inimitably brutal ways. The suffering at the heart of her work has received ample attention. Sylvia Plath did not ignore it. And she admitted, I think my poems come immediately out of the experience I have, but I believe that one should be able to control and manipulate experience, even the most terrifying experience, with an informed and intelligent mind. Describe experience as it was, that was the crux of confessional poetry, and she did it. Her famous poems are Ariel, Lazarus, The Morning Song, um, Poppy in October, Daddy. Daddy is also very significant poem of Sylvia Plath. Her poem Lady Lazarus, a very title Lady Lazarus is, you can say, very strange. Lazarus is a in Christian mythology or Christian history, we can say, Lazarus was brother of Lady McLagin. Uh, Mary Mary McLagan, and Jesus Christ brought dead Lazarus to life. हम वो सुनते रहते हैं कि हजरत ईसा जो है मुर्दों को जिंदा करते थे, तो जिस मुर्दे को उन्होंने जिंदा किया था, दैट वाज लेजरस. And she uses the title Lady Lazarus. We can say she uses the title for a woman who has returned to life after death. And Lazarus is a symbol of resurrection in Christianity, and Lady Lazarus is symbol of resurrection of the speaker of the poem, or Sylvia Plath herself. She actually made several attempts of suicide, and that was one of her failed attempt of suicide. Afterwards, she wrote this poem. In that poem, she towards the end, she claims, dying is an art like everything else. I do it exceptionally well. That is the closing or last line of this poem. Mean, she is not ashamed of for her suicidal attempt. That was a stigma at that time. Her poetry is artfully shaped, setting stark and elevated imagery of the sea, fire, moon, whiteness, and silence. And they suggest purifying, peaceful nature of oblivion. Everything is incorporated within a habit of intense personal meditation, conversation with the self. Her poem Morning Song, that is about the birth of her uh, daughter or baby. By the way, that daughter is Freda, and Freda is daughter of Ted Hughes and Sylvia Plath, and she is also a poet. The artful way in which Sylvia Plath immerses the reader in her experience is illustrated by her poem Daddy, that is an addition that in addition measures the distance between her use of the confessional mode. She said, Daddy is spoken by a girl with an Electra complex. Mean that is her personal um, remark that can help to understand uh, her, you can say, feelings for her father. Actually, she was hardly 9 when her father, Otto Plath, who was a naturalist, was an entomologist or expert of bees, he died and he continued to look for her dead father in remaining her life. And she thinks that her quest for father is part of her inward Electra complex. This poem shows her ambivalent relationship with her father. As I mentioned earlier, ambivalent mean love-hate relationship. Mean love for father and hate for father. Hate for father because she wants to come out of the influence of father, and love for father because she feels there is some psychological want in her life that can be fulfilled only by the character of father. Her tendency to recreate aspects of that relationship in later adult relationships, her attempts at suicide, and her desperate need to come to terms with all these things. The secret of the poem lies in its tension. There is tension of the narrator's attitude to her father and other men, between fear and desire, resentment and tenderness. There is tension beyond this in all human connections. The victim both detests and adores the victimizer, and so is at once repelled and attracted by the brutal drama of life. There is tension in the poem's tone. On one side, there are horrors of personal and general history that poetry calls, and on the other side, that horrifying story is told in fairy tale or folk story manner. Daddy, daddy, you bastard, I am through. These are the lines from the poem. But the impression is more that she is through in the sense of being over and done with than through to and with her father. One point is that there are confessional poets who discover peace, therapeutic release in the disciplines of writing, and those equally disciplined whose writing only pushes them towards the edge. But Sylvia Plath is example of the second one, who fails to get therapeutic value, therapeutic solace through poetry. Our poetry, you can say, fails to provide a release, which was the purpose of confessional poetry. In our poetry, we see the examples of bees, which are used to show the power of women, because in bee we see that there is queen bee and there is a drone and the uh, survival of the bees depend upon the queen bee. Poppy are also fascinate the poet, and she counts uh, these images. Most of the images have been borrowed from the environment which is connected to her father's profession, her father's living, and that inspires her. Personally, uh, she uh, actually led a life that was of trauma and depression. In her anxiety and depression, she was victim of the pain of the present moment. She was alluring, so she had many, you can say,